The ferryman, a gaunt, silent figure whose face seemed etched by salt and wind, offered no farewell as Dean stepped onto the splintering dock. The vessel's engine coughed, then roared, churning the slate-gray water into a transient foam before it turned, a dark silhouette swallowed almost immediately by the encroaching fog. Dean watched it vanish, a final thread connecting him to the mainland severing with a cold, definitive snap. He was alone. Truly alone. The air on the island was thick and heavy, laden with the metallic tang of brine and something else. A damp, earthy scent that spoke of decay and ancient rock. Above him, the sky was a bruised purple pressing down, threatening rain. Dean clutched the worn leather strap of his duffel bag tighter, the canvas digging into his shoulder. His cartographer's tools, meticulously packed, felt like an anchor in the bag, grounding him, yet also weighing him down with the ghost of a past life. He was here to map a new beginning, he told himself, but the landscape around him felt only like an ending. The path from the dock was little more than a goat trail, winding uphill through skeletal gorse bushes and patches of coarse, wind-beaten grass. The only sounds were the distant, mournful cry of gulls and the ceaseless, rhythmic shush of the sea against unseen rocks. He walked, his gaze fixed on the indistinct shape looming through the swirling mist ahead. The abandoned lighthouse. His grandfather's legacy. His grandfather, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 decades, whose death had been relayed by a terse letter from a solicitor, leaving Dean with this inheritance. A cottage on a desolate rock, a lifetime's worth of unspoken words. As he drew closer, the structure materialized from the fog, not with a sudden unveiling, but a slow, hesitant reveal, like a developing photograph. The lighthouse itself was a towering, weather-beaten sentinel, its whitewash long since peeled and stained by salt spray, streaks of rust weeping from its iron cap. Beside it, hunkered low against the relentless wind, was the keeper's cottage. It wasn't the cozy, idyllic image Dean had vaguely held. This was a place of abandonment, of forgotten purpose. The roof sagged in places, tiles gone, exposing the skeletal timbers beneath. A riot of thorny brambles and tenacious weeds had swallowed the small garden plot, their tendrils reaching for the front door like grasping fingers. He pushed through the overgrown vegetation, his boots snagging on unseen roots. The wooden porch groaned under his weight, the planks soft and spongy in spots. The front door, painted a faded, sea-worn blue, hung slightly ajar, rattling faintly in the breeze. He pushed the door inward. It dragged with a low, mournful scrape against the gritty floorboards, kicking up a cloud of ancient dust that glittered in the sliver of gray light filtering through a broken window. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew, salt, and something indefinable. A faint acrid smell, like old metal or forgotten embers. The main room was small, sparse. An overturned chair lay on its side, a scattering of brittle, yellowed newspapers on the floor beside it. A thin film of dust coated every surface, blurring the edges of what little furniture remained. A rickety table, a sagging armchair, a bookshelf filled with titles whose spines were faded beyond recognition. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb, frozen in the moment its last occupant departed. Dean moved deeper, his senses on high alert. He ran a hand over a wooden mantelpiece, the fine dust clinging to his skin. He remembered his grandfather only vaguely, a stern, distant man, his face weathered by sun and sea. A faint scratching sound pulled his attention towards the far corner. He froze, straining his ears. It came again, a delicate, rhythmic scrape, like claws on wood. A mouse, he reasoned, trying to calm the sudden prickle on his neck. Just a mouse. The scratching stopped abruptly as he approached. He peered behind a stack of old fishing nets, expecting to see a small, scurrying creature. Nothing. only the damp, crumbling plaster and the faint, persistent scent of brine. He turned, a peculiar unease beginning to settle in his gut. It wasn't just the isolation or the dilapidation of the cottage. It was a pervasive feeling, a subtle wrongness that seemed to seep from the very walls. He walked to a grimy window, wiping away a patch of dust with his sleeve. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the island whole, leaving only the immediate surroundings visible. The abandoned lighthouse stood like a skeletal finger, pointing accusingly at the leaden sky. A low groan emanated from somewhere above him, deep within the structure. It wasn't the wind, he knew, not the typical creak of old wood settling. This was a resonant, almost organic sound, like something stirring from a long, troubled sleep. Dean's breath hitched. He told himself it was the house, merely the house. He was here for solitude, for a fresh start. The ferryman's vessel, a dark silhouette against the turbulent grays of the water, had long since vanished. Dean stood on the splintering dock, the air biting at his exposed skin, thick with the scent of salt and decay. The silence that followed the engine's roar was profound, broken only by the sloshing of the waves against the barnacled pilings and the lonely cry of a gull. He shouldered his worn duffel bag, the weight of it a familiar anchor, and began the trek towards the cottage. The path was overgrown, a faint scar across the island's rugged, windswept terrain. Gnarled, stunted trees clawed at the sky, their branches skeletal fingers in the perpetual mist. The ground underfoot was a spongy mix of damp earth and crushed shells. With each step, the isolation pressed in, a physical presence. This was it then, his fresh start. He tried to focus on the practicalities, the cottage, the unpacking, the solitude he craved. The cottage emerged from the swirling fog, a hunched gray shape clinging precariously to the cliff edge. A rusted weather vane, twisted into an indecipherable shape, groaned softly atop the roof. The front door, thick with peeling paint, offered little resistance. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy panes. His first task was to air the place out. He forced open a stubborn window in the small living area, letting in a gust of frigid, damp air that carried with it the ceaseless murmur of the sea. As he stood there, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, he noticed something peculiar. The tide, by his internal clock and what little he knew of this island's patterns from the ferry journey, seemed unusually high. The water churned aggressively, clawing at the base of the cliff with a relentless, hungry energy. He squinted, trying to discern the familiar high water mark, but the spray obscured his view. It was probably just the storm surge, he reasoned, a typical feature of these exposed coastal regions. Nothing out of the ordinary, merely a new environment to adapt to. The wind had picked up, howling around the eaves, rattling the loose window panes. But amidst the clamor, he began to perceive something else. A faint, low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Not words, not distinct sounds, but a cadence. A rhythmic, almost melodic hum that felt deeply unsettling. It was the wind, of course. His mind, still raw from loss, was prone to such auditory illusions. He spent the next few hours methodically exploring the small cottage, trying to impose some order on the inherited chaos. His grandfather had been a man of eccentric habits, judging by the stacks of brittle maps, nautical instruments, and peculiar carvings scattered about. He pulled it out. It was a journal, its leather cover warped and discolored by salt water, its pages swollen and fragile. The spine was cracked, and the gilt lettering, once proud, was almost entirely eroded. He handled it with care, the paper rustling like dry leaves. Flipping through the first few pages, he saw his grandfather's familiar spidery hand. The early entries were mundane. Weather observations, supply lists, Notes on the upkeep of the abandoned lighthouse visible from the cottage window. Its skeletal frame a stark silhouette against the perpetually bruised sky. But as he delved deeper, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, sprawling across the page. The sketches, initially precise coastal charts, devolved into disturbing abstract scrawls. Tentacular forms writhed across pages, intertwined with geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. There were depictions of impossible structures beneath the waves, vast and menacing, and strange, bulbous eyes peering from impossible depths. Dean's breath hitched. These weren't the meticulous drawings of a cartographer. They were the fevered imaginings of a mind under duress. Then he found the words, scrawled repeatedly, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. The deep song. It calls, it pulls, always listening. The tide. It changes, not the moon, not the sun. And further down, etched with desperate force. They will not believe. The pact forgotten. It stirs. The light. It must never go out. The deep song. It is not wind. His grandfather had been isolated, yes, prone to melancholy, but never to this extent. Hallucinations, delusions brought on by extreme solitude. The scratch of the pen on the page, the frantic, looping script of his grandfather's final entries echoed in Dean's mind. They watch. They wait. But the chill that had settled in his bones, colder than any sea mist, refused to lift. He needed answers, something tangible to anchor his back to logic, or to confirm the terrifying implications that gnawed at the edges of his reason. Dean began his search in his grandfather's study, a small, cramped room overlooking the churning gray expanse of the ocean. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grime-streaked window panes, illuminating stacks of forgotten tomes and charts. He ran a hand over a leather-bound spine, the material brittle and cold beneath his fingers. He pulled down heavy volumes, their pages crackling like dried leaves. Most were maritime histories, treatises on navigation, or guides to local flora and fauna. But nestled among them, he found a collection of more obscure texts, faded pamphlets detailing local folklore, an amateur history of the island penned by a long-dead recluse, and a series of hand-drawn maps of the coast, some marked with strange, archaic symbols he couldn't decipher. One slim, unassuming book, its cover worn smooth, caught his eye. He opened it, the brittle pages releasing a puff of fine gray dust. The language was flowery, almost poetic, describing ancient rites performed by the island's first inhabitants, offerings made to the sleeper beneath the waves to ensure safe passage and bountiful catches. There were unsettling woodcut illustrations, grotesque, vaguely humanoid figures with too many limbs, their eyes like bottomless pits, depicted rising from a stylized sunken city. This wasn't the rambling of one man. These were legends. The text spoke of an ancient pact, a delicate balance maintained for centuries, broken only when the offering ceased. It mentioned a great cataclysm, a city swallowed by the sea, and the subsequent awakening of something vast and terrible. Dean's eyes darted to his grandfather's journal, then back to the book. The words seemed to align, to echo. Driven by a desperate need for more, Dean decided he had to search the abandoned lighthouse. His grandfather had been its last keeper, and it stood as a monument to his isolation, a place where he might have hoarded more clues, more evidence. The hike was arduous, the path overgrown and slick with dew and sea spray. The fog, a constant shroud on the island, thickened as he ascended, swallowing the world around him until only the crunch of his boots on gravel and the distant groan of the waves were audible. The lighthouse loomed out of the mist, a skeletal finger of stone reaching into the gray sky. Its windows were shattered, gaping mouths that howled in the wind. The iron door, rusted solid, took all his strength to pry open, screeching in protest. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of decay and damp stone. In the lantern room, broken glass glittered underfoot like scattered teeth. The great lens, once a beacon of hope, was shattered, its fragments reflecting the pale light in distorted patterns. He searched methodically, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Behind a loose panel in the wall, he found a small wooden box. They hunger. The great deep stirs. He returned to the cottage, the box clutched tight in his hand, the journal's words no longer just the ramblings of a lonely man. The pact. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was real. And whatever it entailed, whatever ancient bargain had been struck, it had been broken. That night, Dean's dreams were not his own. He was submerged, not in water, but in a thick, viscous medium that pressed in on him from all sides. He saw flashes of colossal cyclopean architecture, structures built of black stone that pulsed with a sickly internal light. He woke with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat, the taste of salt and something metallic on his tongue. The first rays of dawn, struggling through the ever-present fog, cast a dim, watery light into the cottage. Dean pushed himself upright, his head throbbing, the dream clinging to him like a shroud. He recoiled, peering down. A patch of strange, bioluminescent algae pulsed faintly on the rough-hewn timber, a sickly green-blue glow against the dull wood. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, radiating a faint, internal light that seemed to breathe. He stared, frozen, then followed its insidious trail with his eyes. It snaked from beneath the floorboards, across the sill of the window and up the wall, clinging to the rough plaster. It was here, inside the cottage, growing in places where no light ever touched, where no sea spray could reach. The pact was broken, and something was reaching out from the deep into his world. Dean's dreams that night were not dreams of sleep, but of drowning. He didn't struggle against the dark, frigid water. He simply sank, his lungs burning with a phantom ache, his body pulled down by an invisible current. Shapes shifted in the gloom beneath him, vast and indistinct, hinting at ancient architecture swallowed by the abyssal cold. He woke with a gasp, the taste of brine on his tongue, his sheets tangled around him like kelp. The morning light, usually a welcome balm, felt thin and fragile, barely holding back the encroaching gray. A low, persistent hum had settled into the cottage, a vibration more than a sound, resonating in the floorboards, traveling up through his bare feet and settling deep in his chest. It felt organic, like the distant thrum of a leviathan's heart, or the slow churn of subterranean tides. He tried to pinpoint its origin, moving from room to room, pressing his ear to the walls, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a foundational note in the island's bleak symphony. He made coffee, the ritual a small anchor in the rising tide of unease. He was meticulous about his tools, always returning them to their designated spots. A flicker of doubt, a momentary lapse of memory brushed against his mind. Had he moved it? He couldn't recall. Later, while shaving, he stared at his reflection in the steamed-up mirror. For a split second, the image rippled, as if viewed through disturbed water. A faint, almost imperceptible film, like sea scum, seemed to cling to his skin. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes, and the illusion vanished, leaving only his tired, familiar face staring back. His hand trembled slightly as he finished shaving. The hum intensified, not in volume, but in its invasive quality. He found himself pausing, listening, feeling a strange pull towards the window that overlooked the churning sea. He'd previously dismissed many of the entries as the ramblings of a man losing his grip. But now, armed with the knowledge of a pact, he saw new meaning in the odd phrases, the desperate pleas. The offerings must be sufficient. The hunger grows. It demands a tribute, a tether to this world. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn bookshelf, feeling for anything unusual. His fingers brushed against a loose panel, almost imperceptible. He pressed, and with a soft click, a narrow compartment swung inward. It was humanoid, yet distinctly alien, with elongated limbs and a gaping, toothless maw. Its eyes were two chips of obsidian, reflecting no light, only absorbing it. Around its neck hung a necklace of shark teeth, each one razor-sharp and discolored with age. This wasn't just warding. This was appeasement, sacrifice. And if the pact had been broken, if the offerings had ceased, then whatever ancient hunger had been sated was now ravenous. The hum pulsed, growing louder, more insistent. He snatched up the idol, the wood strangely warm against his skin, and felt an inexplicable urge to take it to the abandoned lighthouse. Perhaps there, where his grandfather had spent his final years, he would find more. The fog had thickened, muffling the world, transforming the familiar path into a winding tunnel of gray. He reached the base of the abandoned lighthouse, its skeletal frame rising into the mist, a monument to solitude and forgotten purpose. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, rust, and something profoundly ancient, a smell that clung to the very stone. He ascended the spiral stairs, his boots clanging on the metal treads, each step a declaration of his presence in a place that felt profoundly unwelcoming. The hum here was deafening, vibrating through his bones, making his teeth ache. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes opaque with salt and grime, the enormous lamp mechanism frozen in time. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Nothing. Just the swirling mist outside the grimy windows. It was formless yet defined, like a column of ink suspended in water, flowing with an unnatural grace. A faint, sickening odor, like rotting fish and ozone, filled his nostrils. Dean froze, every muscle screaming for flight, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The hum intensified, a piercing drone that threatened to shatter his very thoughts. He stumbled backward, dropping the idol with a clatter, his hands flying up as if to ward off an invisible blow. He stood gasping, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling uncontrollably. The hum receded slightly, a cruel mockery of respite. It was real. It had been there, and it had almost touched him. The pact wasn't just broken. The entity was here. It was awake, and it was waiting. The loose panel in the abandoned lighthouse's bookshelf yielded with a sigh of ancient wood. Dean's fingers, still tingling from the discovery, reached into the cool, shadowed recess. Nestled amongst the dried seaweed and smooth, dark stones, polished black like chips of a lightless abyss, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was older, more worn than the one he'd been poring over, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate knotwork design that seemed to writhe beneath his touch. The first few pages were brittle, almost transparent, filled with his grandfather's familiar, precise script, but the tone was markedly different. Less observational, more visceral. It stirs. I feel its hunger, a pull on the very marrow of my bones. Dean's breath hitched. This wasn't the detached scientific curiosity he'd seen before. This was fear, raw and unvarnished. He turned the page, the thin paper rustling like a dry leaf. The pact holds, but it demands. It demands vigilance. Not merely to observe, but to feed the stillness, to sing the countersong. Dean frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Countersong? He scanned further, his eyes darting across lines filled with increasingly desperate prose. His grandfather hadn't just been a chronicler. He had been an active participant, a guardian, perhaps, or a jailer. The journal described a ritual, fragmented and cryptic, but clear enough to paint a horrifying picture. It spoke of specific lunar cycles, of offerings placed at the lowest point of the lighthouse, of chants uttered into the churning spray. The stones hum, an entry from decades past detailed. A low thrumming that echoes the deep song but bends it, tames it for a time. They weren't just curiosities, they were components. His grandfather had been performing a ritual, a desperate solitary act to keep something dormant. As he read, a low, persistent hum began to seep into the air, not from the journal itself, but from everywhere and nowhere. He could feel it in the tremors of his hands as he held the journal. The words on the page began to swim, the ink blurring at the edges. Dean blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions persisted. The ornate knotwork on the journal's cover seemed to shift, the lines weaving and unweaving themselves into new, unsettling patterns. Was it the wind? The old structure groaning? Or was it the deep song itself reaching into his mind? A sudden, jarring shift in his peripheral vision made him flinch. He spun around, but the shapes vanished, leaving only the familiar, dust-mote-filled light. He was seeing things. He forced himself to focus back on the journal. The lowest point, his grandfather had scrawled, the letters leaning wildly as if written in haste or distress. Only there can the true binding be performed. The key. It lies beneath the foundation, etched into the stone. Dean's gaze dropped to the floor beneath his feet. He knelt, running his hands over the rough-hewn planks, searching for any inconsistency. The planks were old, weathered, but firmly set. He pressed, he knocked, he listened. The deep song, a relentless drone in his ears, making his head ache, making his thoughts feel thick and sluggish. It was subtle, expertly concealed, unlike the obvious floorboards. He pressed harder, testing its resilience. It gave slightly. He traced the outline, feeling for a catch, a release. The journal mentioned the key, etched into the stone. Could it be a physical key or a symbolic one, a pattern? He looked down at the knotwork on the journal's cover, then back at the faint seam. The pattern on the cover was an interlocking series of curves and angles. He remembered seeing a similar, faded etching on one of the larger, immovable stones near the lighthouse's foundation, outside. Was there a connection? He returned to the seam, pressing along its length. Below, revealed by the opening, was not a cellar, but a narrow, winding stone staircase, descending into absolute blackness. This was it. The hidden chamber. The crypt beneath the abandoned lighthouse. Dean's fingers traced the grain of the rough-hewn planks. He shuffled forward on his knees, his ear almost to the floor, trying to pinpoint the source. It was directly beneath him, a deep, resonant tremor that spoke of immense, contained power. The old timber groaned faintly under his weight, a familiar sound in the abandoned lighthouse, yet now it carried a new, unsettling overtone. He ran his hand over the weathered surface again, meticulously, feeling for any give, any seam that wasn't part of the natural aging of the wood. It wasn't a natural crack. It was too straight, too deliberate. He pressed harder, testing the plank. It didn't budge. He tried another, then another, his frustration building with the intensity of the hum. It was here. He knew it. Then his thumb snagged on a tiny, almost invisible indentation near the edge of the groove. It was a shallow depression, barely wide enough for his fingertip. He pressed into it, a soft click echoing in the otherwise silent room. A section of the floor, perhaps 3 feet by 4, shifted. Not upwards, but inwards, sinking slightly with a low groan of ancient hinges. He scrambled back, heart hammering against his ribs, watching as the section of floor slowly, silently, began to pivot inwards, revealing a rectangular opening. Below, darkness swallowed the beam of his headlamp, a darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lack it. It was a living sound, a deep, guttural throb. Rough-hewn stone steps, slick with moisture, descended into the gloom. He swallowed, the taste of fear sharp in his mouth. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to seal the opening and pretend he'd never found it. But the hum, insistent and compelling, drew him forward. He had to. He swung his legs over the edge, feeling for the first step with his foot. Strange, angular carvings, unlike anything he had ever seen, adorned some of the stones. Not symbols, but intricate, interlocking patterns that seemed to shift and writhe at the periphery of his vision. The chamber at the bottom was small, circular, barely large enough for him to stand upright without his head scraping the low ceiling. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the source of the hum. It shimmered with an internal light that defied description. A spectrum of violets, indigos, and greens that bled into hues Dean's eyes struggled to process. It wasn't merely glowing. It was breathing, contracting, and expanding with a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the hum filling the chamber. This wasn't just ancient. It was primordial. It was a fragment of something vast, something that had no business existing on this plane of reality. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through his teeth, through his very bones, threatening to shatter him from the inside out. As he stared at the shimmering mass, the impossible light seemed to reach out, to penetrate his very being. A sudden, overwhelming pressure clamped down on his mind, a flood of images, not seen with his eyes, but felt directly in his consciousness. He saw the island, but it was dissolving. The familiar cliffs melted like wax, the soil turning to viscous black ichor. He saw impossible structures, vast and cyclopean, rising from the crushing depths, their surfaces slick with unspeakable slime, impossibly vast and utterly indifferent. And then he saw himself, his own form, stretched and distorted, his limbs elongating, his skin turning pallid and translucent. He was becoming part of it, absorbed, his individuality dissolving into the vast cosmic indifference of the entity. The island was merely a stepping stone, a point of emergence. He was just another morsel, another consciousness to be assimilated, another piece of reality to be twisted and reshaped into its own horrifying image. The vision snapped away as suddenly as it had come, leaving Dean gasping, clinging to the rough stone wall. His head throbbed, his stomach churned, and a primal scream tried to tear its way from his throat, but only a choked sob escaped. The entity wasn't just stirring. It was here. It was awake. And it had touched him. The pulsating mass in the center of the chamber seemed to grow brighter, its hum deepening. A silent, knowing throb that echoed the frantic beating of his own heart. He was trapped, not by walls or locked doors, but by the sheer, overwhelming presence of something ancient and malevolent. Something that had been waiting, patiently, beneath the waves. And now, it knew he was here. Dean's hands pressed flat against the rough planks, felt the tremor escalate from a gentle thrum to a violent shudder. It wasn't just beneath the floorboards now. It was in the air, a palpable pressure that pressed against his eardrums, rattling the delicate bones within. He scrambled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. The floor, once merely vibrating, now felt as if it were trying to heave itself upward. A vast, unseen engine straining beneath the ancient structure. A fine dust, stirred from decades of dormancy, began to drift down from the ceiling, catching the faint gray light that seeped through the grimy windows. The smell of brine and decay, always present in the lighthouse, sharpened, taking on a metallic tang, like old blood mixed with ozone. Dean pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound was no longer external. It felt as though something was trying to uncoil itself inside his skull, a foreign presence unfurling its tendrils, seeking purchase. A cold dread, far more profound than any fear he'd known, seized him. This wasn't just the entity attempting to break through. It was trying to break in, to occupy, to possess. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he stumbled to his feet, swaying. The lighthouse seemed to tilt, the sturdy walls warping at the edges of his vision. He gripped the nearest support beam, his knuckles white. His breath hitched in his throat, a ragged, desperate sound. He could feel it, a subtle shift in his perception, as if the world was suddenly viewed through a distorted lens, the colors dulled, the edges blurred. Come. His gaze darted around the sparse room, landing on the scarred writing desk where he'd left his grandfather's journal. It was the only lead he had, the only repository of knowledge about this insidious, encroaching horror. He lurched towards the desk, his legs feeling like lead. Each step was a struggle against the unseen force that seemed to push back against him, to hold him captive within the shuddering structure. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere of the deep was being drawn into the lighthouse, displacing the breathable air. His lungs burned. Reaching the desk, his trembling fingers fumbled for the leather-bound book. He snatched it up, its weight strangely comforting in his grasp, a tangible link to a past that held answers. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning frantically, skipping over his grandfather's initial, relatively sane observations, past the increasingly agitated scribblings and paranoid warnings. He needed a solution, not a history. The hum intensified again, a piercing whine now layered beneath the guttural bass. The glass in the lantern room above them groaned, a high-pitched shriek that threatened to shatter. The planks directly beneath his feet buckled, a thin crack appearing in the aged wood. He found it. A section near the back, hastily scrawled, the ink bleeding slightly as if written in a hurry or under duress. His grandfather's hand, usually precise, was erratic here, the words slanting wildly across the page. The breach. It cannot be truly sealed, only bound. A tether, to hold it. The deep demands a price. Always a price. Dean's eyes raced over the words, his mind struggling to process the implications amidst the growing cacophony. Freely given. Not merely blood, but the very essence. A willing surrender. A severance. The soul's deepest connection. Severed. The guardian bound to the threshold, forever separate. A sacrifice not of death, but of true existence. His breath caught. Not death, but true existence? The soul's deepest connection severed? It implied a living sacrifice, but one that transcended mere physical demise. It meant a permanent internal rupture, a complete isolation from humanity, from everything that made life meaningful. It meant becoming something else entirely. A living prison for the entity, or a perpetual sentinel against it, stripped of all that he was. A shudder ran through the entire abandoned lighthouse, more violent than any before. The crack in the floorboards widened, groaning ominously. Dean clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The solution was there, incomplete and horrifying, but it was there. The price was not just his life, but his self. The entity didn't merely kill. It unmade, unraveled the very fabric of being, leaving an empty vessel, a hollow echo. A sacrifice, yes, but one far more profound, a permanent internal rupture that would isolate one from all humanity, from all that was warm and real. The implications chilled him to the bone, a cold that seeped past his skin and into his marrow. He felt the island shift around him, a living thing groaning under an unbearable weight. The air, already heavy with sea salt and damp earth, now carried a new, cloying scent, a mix of stagnant water and something vaguely metallic, like old blood oxidizing on forgotten iron. Outside the cottage, the weather had become a malevolent force. The wind shrieked, a banshee wail that tore at the eaves, not a natural gale, but a sound laden with malice. Each gust seemed to carry a physical weight, pressing against the walls, threatening to buckle the ancient timbers. He clutched the journal, its worn leather cover a small, familiar anchor in the storm of his unraveling perception. It sought to drown him in madness before he could even begin. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. The journal held the key, not just to understanding the pact, but to undoing it. His grandfather, in his meticulous obsessive hand, had detailed a counter-ritual. It wasn't about banishment, not truly. It was about reversal. About severing the entity's hold, not on the island, but on the connection forged by the pact itself. And the cost? The true existence Dean had just read about. That wasn't merely a threat for those taken by the entity. It was the price of the counter-ritual. To sever the entity's connection, one had to sever a piece of their own soul, a vital thread that wove them into the tapestry of human experience. It meant becoming an observer, eternally present but eternally detached, a ghost in one's own life. He had already lost so much. He wouldn't become the entity's puppet. He wouldn't let it claim this island, this last refuge. The journal described specific components, things his grandfather had gathered, or perhaps created, in his desperate final days. A carved piece of ancient driftwood, imbued with the island's raw energy. A specific chart, not of the island's surface, but of the currents beneath, showing the hidden pathways of the deep. Dean had seen the driftwood, a gnarled, twisted thing, in a locked chest in the cottage's cellar. The chart and compass, he suspected, were hidden within the vast collection of his grandfather's cartography tools. He found the chart first, tucked inside a rolled-up sea map of the North Atlantic. It wasn't paper. It was a thin sheet of polished slate, etched with intricate lines and symbols that pulsed faintly with an inner light. The compass was nestled amongst rusted dividers and ancient pencils, its brass casing tarnished, its needle twitching erratically, refusing to settle. The journal was explicit. The counter-ritual had to be performed at the nexus of the island's power, the place where the pact had been made, where the entity's influence was strongest, the abandoned lighthouse. Stepping out of the cottage was like plunging into a different dimension. The wind immediately tore at his oilskin coat, trying to peel it from his body. Rain, icy and relentless, stung his exposed skin. The vegetation had undergone a grotesque transformation. What had been hardy seagrass now writhed like tentacles, their blades elongated and strangely translucent. He stumbled forward, leaning into the wind, his eyes squinting against the deluge. He gripped the journal, the slate chart, and the compass, their weight a tangible reminder of his purpose. The abandoned lighthouse loomed ahead, a skeletal finger pointing into the bruised, churning sky. The lamp house, once a beacon of hope, was a shattered cavity, its glass panes long gone, leaving gaping eyes that stared blankly at the tempest. As he drew closer, the thrumming intensified, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the structure. The air around the lighthouse was thick, heavy, charged with an immense malevolent energy. He reached the base of the lighthouse, the wind howling around him like a pack of starved wolves. The heavy iron door, rusted solid, was ajar, pried open by an unseen force. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to seal it. He had been fighting a slow, insidious war against an obliteration of self. A gale howled, tearing at the cottage's ancient timbers, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest brewing within Dean. He clutched the heavy tome, its pages brittle beneath his fingers, the ink a dark, damning testament. It was the entity calling. The lantern swung wildly in his grip as he stepped out into the churning night. Rain lashed down, driven by winds that threatened to rip him from his feet. The path to the abandoned lighthouse was a treacherous smear of mud and loose shale, but Dean moved with a frantic urgency, his focus narrowed to the single towering silhouette against the bruised sky. Each step was a battle against the elements, and something far more insidious. The air grew heavy, pressing in on his chest, making each breath a shallow struggle. He pushed them away, his mind a fortress against the encroaching chaos. His determination was a burning ember in his gut, fueled by a terrible understanding. The true existence wasn't a gift, it was a curse. He wouldn't let it touch anyone else. The iron door of the abandoned lighthouse groaned open under his shoulder, revealing a maw of blackness within. The wind's shriek was muffled here, replaced by a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very soles of his boots. It was the sound of something immense, stirring just beneath the surface of reality. He began his ascent, the spiral staircase a dizzying tunnel into the unknown. The psychological attacks intensified with every step upwards. He saw her face, his beloved, smiling, then distorted, accusing him of abandonment, of failing her. He stumbled, his heart clenching with a familiar, searing grief. No, he thought, forcing his mind back to the present. This is not real. This is its weapon. He gripped the journal tighter, its weight a grounding force. He remembered the grandfather's frantic scrawl, the desperate hope for a final ceiling. Higher he climbed, the thrumming growing into an unbearable pressure against his eardrums. The very structure of the lighthouse seemed to groan in protest, the stone weeping, the metal shrieking. He reached the lantern room, the final chamber, and froze. But it wasn't the storm that held his gaze. It pulsed with a sickening rhythm, drawing the air from his lungs, distorting the very space around it. This was it, the fully manifested presence, the portal. He was insignificant, a speck of dust before an entity that predated stars. Yet a fierce resolve flared, burning away the fear. He wouldn't be a speck of dust consumed. He consulted the journal, its final coded pages illuminated by his trembling lantern. The ritual was complex, demanding a specific alignment of symbols, a resonant frequency, and a profound sacrifice. His grandfather had understood the pact, but not how to break it entirely. The entity didn't just need to be sealed, its connection to this reality needed to be severed, permanently. As he worked, the entity lashed out. The air grew frigid, then scorching hot. Invisible hands shoved him, sending him stumbling. He fought through it, chanting the low, guttural words from the journal, his voice hoarse against the roaring chaos. He placed the last symbol, and the vortex pulsed violently, a sickening lurch that made the entire lighthouse shudder. The entity knew. It raged. Then came the reveal. The final instruction in the journal, faded but clear, spoke not of a physical offering, but of a binding. The pact wasn't just to keep the entity out. It was to maintain a fragile, terrible balance, to provide a constant, conscious anchor. His grandfather hadn't sealed it. He had merely contained it, becoming a part of the containment itself. The true existence was the entity's twisted promise to him. Eternal vigilance, eternal solitude, forever bound to the lighthouse, preventing its full incursion, but never truly free. Dean now understood the profound, lonely sacrifice his grandfather had made. But Dean wouldn't just contain it. He would break the chain. The true sacrifice wasn't to become the new guardian. It was to use his own vital connection, his very essence, to sever the entity's tether to this world entirely. It meant giving up his own true existence as a free man, as a whole being, to ensure the world's safety. It meant a severing, not of his soul's deepest connection, but of his own connection to the world beyond these walls. With a final, desperate surge of will, Dean stood before the swirling maelstrom. He gripped the journal, its pages now fluttering wildly, and uttered the last binding phrase, not as a chant, but as a guttural, defiant declaration. As the words left his lips, he felt a tearing sensation, not of flesh, but of something far deeper, a vital thread unraveling from the core of his being. A profound, icy emptiness spread through him, a severance from warmth, from memory, from the very concept of self. The vortex shrieked, a sound that flayed his mind, then began to recede. The pressure in the room eased, the deafening thrum diminishing to a faint, distant hum. The portal was closing. Dean stood there, swaying, the storm still raging outside, but the true tempest within him had settled into an unnerving calm. The emptiness was vast, absolute. The entity didn't merely consume, it redefined. It didn't just take life, it reshaped what it meant to live. And he was standing at the precipice of that new, terrifying definition. The salt-laced dampness clung to his clothes, a chill that seeped into his bones, deeper than the ocean spray outside. He could hear it now, not with his ears, but with some deeper, nascent sense. A vast, resonant thrumming that was both ancient and utterly alien. The deep song. It was no longer distant, no longer merely an echo. It was here, within the very stone of the tower, within the marrow of his being. He ascended the spiral staircase, his hand scraping against the rough, cold iron railing. Each step groaned, a metallic lament beneath his weight. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, painting fleeting arcs on the grimy walls, illuminating patches of lichen and peeling paint. His gaze, however, was fixed on the central column, the stone spine of the lighthouse. Reaching the lantern room, the glass panes long shattered, he felt the full, crushing force of the entity's presence. He scanned the central column, the granite rough beneath his fingertips, until his light settled on a series of faint, almost eroded carvings. They were not symbols he recognized from any cartography, but fluid, unsettling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. His grandfather had called them binding sigils, not to contain the entity, but to channel it, to maintain the pact. And to break it, the journal implied, required a reciprocal offering. His breath hitched. The words from the journal flooded back. The soul's deepest connection severed. It wasn't about severing the entity's connection to the world, but severing his connection to his own defined reality, to break the pact from within. He understood the terrible cost now. He had to offer a piece of himself, not of his body, but of his very perception, to disrupt the channel. A faint, sickening tremor ran through the column, vibrating up his arm, settling deep in his chest. A low hum filled his head, growing louder, deeper, until it was a roaring torrent of sound that drowned out the wind, the waves, his own frantic heartbeat. Then, the reveal. It wasn't a sound, not truly. It was a deluge of pure, unfiltered sensation. He saw the entity, not as a singular being, but as an enormous, sprawling consciousness, a fundamental force that permeated the deep, a living, hungry current beneath the surface of reality. And he saw himself, not as Dean, the cartographer, but as a tiny, fragile node within that immense network, a newly awakened nerve ending. The true existence wasn't death. It was assimilation, a horrifying expansion of self into something utterly inhuman. The deep song was not a call to the depths, but the depths themselves, singing through him. As he focused his will, pushing against the overwhelming tide of alien knowledge, he felt a sharp, tearing sensation, not of flesh, but of his very perception. He stumbled back, his legs weak, his mind reeling. The immediate threat, the pull into the crushing depths, was gone. The lighthouse stood silent, save for the wailing wind. But Dean was not the same. He looked out at the churning ocean, and the gray, familiar waves seemed to pulse with an inner light, a hidden network of currents and consciousness he could now almost perceive. The island, once a refuge, now felt like a part of his own altered being. He walked down the winding stairs, each step a testament to his continued fragile existence. He was free from the immediate grasp of the entity. Yes, but he carried its song within him now, an unbearable knowledge, a constant hum beneath his thoughts. He was no longer just Dean. He was a vessel for the deep song, a living testament to a truth humanity was never meant to comprehend.